I had another life before the one that led me here. Mercury said I would have to live it all again if I were to build the same relationships as before. So he took me back to my beginning and recreated my original body. I was actually one of the first generation of Homo sapiens. Life was hard and brutal. I developed the skills of a warrior, or what passed for one at the time. While others of that first generation hunted and gathered their food, I killed for mine. I sought out other tribes, Homo sapiens and the not quite fully evolved Homo erectus, and murdered them, took their food, their furs, and whatever caught my fancy. I was aware on some level that this was wrong, because I still had my memories from the previous life walled off in my brain. But it was required that I do exactly as I had done the first time I lived this life. It was around this time that I first came across Farrell. She was the first and only foe that I ever lost against. Though she didn't kill me, she put me in my place. I learned remorse from her in our short time together and vowed to change my ways. I stopped killing and tried hunting and gathering. I was able to hunt just fine. It really wasn't that different from murder, but the gathering proved more difficult. I didn't know how to identify the plants that were okay to eat. I got seriously ill a few times, but always recovered. Until I didn't. It was winter, and I was barely surviving. Farrell had moved on long before, and I was alone. I had found a depression in the side of the mountain. Not a cave, nothing that deep, just a slight depression that provided a small bit of relief from the incessant wind. I was freezing and starving. I was oh so tempted to go hunting a human for the ease of a good meal gathered by someone else, but I didn't. I wrapped myself tightly in my furs and went out into the forest. Though I hunted and found a kill, I also found a bush full of berries that I didn't recognize, and I took them all. Back in my insufficient shelter, I ate the meat and the berries as quickly as possible. The berries were bitter and unpalatable, but the hunger was everything, and I ate it all. With food in my belly, I went to sleep, but those berries, they were the death of me. I'll spare you the gory details, but by morning, all that was left of me was an empty body. I awoke in the afterlife. I knew immediately where I was and what had happened. I also knew that I had to stay the course and do my time in Gehenna. I didn't get much opportunity to inspect the surroundings that I had found so strange and terrifying the first time I lived it. After a brief wait, I was processed at intake and sent to Anubis to have my heart weighed against the feather of Ma'at. I was found wanting, of course, and sentenced to Gehenna. I took a deep breath and went to my punishment, knowing it would be worth it in the end. I spent centuries there, paying for my sins and paying for my arrogance. But in my first life, a change was eventually effected in me. And when the time came, I was taken back to Anubis. This time, my heart balanced with the feather on the scales. I had reached tabula rasa, a clean slate. At this point, I was offered the opportunity to work for the afterlife, as I was not eligible for reincarnation for centuries more. I was evaluated, and it was decided that I would make a good reaper, and so I learned, again, to separate the soul of the deceased from the body that housed it, and bring it to the afterlife. In those days, the black cloak and scythe were the standard gear for reapers, and I wore and carried mine with pride. I was finally doing something good for the universe, and I was on the path back to my lost loved ones. I made friends and enjoyed my unlife fully, even though I never made it farther than Sheol. During this time in my first life, there had been a war waged between Inferno and Paradise, and it was unsafe to travel in either direction. Here in the Shadow Realm, there was no similar war between Gehenna and Bliss to give me the excuse not to move up. I made sure not to do too much good so that I had an excuse to remain in Shale. I began to remake friends, some that I knew from the other universe, and some that were new. I met with some of the gods and goddesses, all but Mercury, assuming I was just another soul. For the second time, I built a rapport with Kronos, the god of time, who was in charge of the Reapers, as the end of someone's time fell under his purview. We became well acquainted. We spent a lot of time together, having a drink or wandering by the Lethe. Mercury maintained his contact with me, though we didn't talk about who I was or why I was there. And then the day came. One day, after a conversation about the work I did in the Reaper department, Mercury became very serious. He asked me when I was eligible for reincarnation. I told him that I had actually become eligible a few decades before, that I enjoyed working with the Reapers and had decided to opt out. He explained that he needed an oracle on Earth and that he wanted me to fill that job for him. This had all happened before, and I knew my part. I protested because I had no magical abilities, but he said that was easily remedied, that he would give me the abilities I would need before I went back. I told him I would take some time to think about it, and then talked about it with Kronos. Kronos told me that it was my decision, but he thought that I could do some real good as an oracle on Gaia. This was as it had been before. The first time I had waffled about, trying to decide if it was worth it, as I had spent millennia in the afterlife already. And then I had a thought, what were 50 or 60 years more? I would be back in no time, working with my friends again. Remembering these details from before occupied me until it was time. Before I went to reincarnation, Kronos and Mercury gifted me with a tiny scythe and a pocket watch that they had asked Hephaestus to make for me. They promised to keep the gift safe for me until I returned. And then Mercury touched my forehead and placed what looked and felt like a burning star with a key at its center behind my eyes. And then conscious thought cut off. When I became aware again, I was a baby in the arms of a woman in an ancient land, approximately 10,000 years ago. I never knew the woman who was my mother. She died on the streets of Tarvin from an unknown illness. Tarvin was a village in the principality of the great king who united humans and other kind. I never knew exactly how she died. I was unable to find her in either of my afterlives, so I suppose I'll never know. A man and a woman from outside the village found me clutched to my mother's unmoving chest. They took me home and raised me as their own son. Then, one day, they had a little girl. The girl and I grew up as siblings, but it was not all harmony and bliss. The part of me that had done all this before was full of joy. The girl and I squabbled constantly, and our poor mother wanted to tear her hair out. Our father took long walks away to avoid our fighting. It was typical, petty sibling fighting, but it didn't make it any easier on our parents. But one day, things began to change. One day our mother took my sister aside and began to have quiet conversations with her. I didn't know it at the time, but my mother was explaining to my sister just exactly what she, my sister, was. That she was a Naga, with abilities and powers beyond the scope of humans. That, to the humans, my sister would seem to be one of the other kind, a monster. Mother told her of the dangers of ever displaying her abilities to the humans. That there were many who still didn't trust the peace between them and the so-called monsters. But I didn't know this at the time, because I was dealing with issues of my own. I began hearing voices. I soon worked out that I was hearing the gods themselves, and not long after, I began to see them as well. I eventually learned that the first god that spoke with me was Mercury, but in the very beginning, I was terrified. So much so that when my sister walked in the first time I was talking to one of them, I shoved her out of the room. I regretted it immediately. I made up my mind to bring this new development to my mother. She was kind and loving, and I knew that no matter what I told her, she would support me. The next morning, I told my mother about my newfound abilities. or rather she approached me about it. Apparently my sister had reported that something strange was going on. Mother seemed apprehensive about my revelation, but didn't say much about it. She told me we would discuss it later. She went to see the village seer a few times, and one day called my sister and I in to talk. The seer had identified me as the rare and, in fact, only male oracle in existence. Apparently this increased the danger we found ourselves in. Mother explained a bit about sister and being a Naga, and then correlated that some of the humans and even some of the other kind might take offense at our existence, simply because of the abilities we each had been given. Sister and I were told to be very careful, to never reveal what we were or what we could do. With this threat over our heads, my sister and I finally ceased fighting and started protecting one another instead. And then, horror struck. We were preparing for bed one evening when I remembered my father was still out in the barn, finishing up for the day. I went to my mother and asked if he still needed help, but she told me no, and sent me to wash up for bed. As I was about to turn in, I suddenly heard my father screaming from outside. I ran into the hall, nearly running over my sister as she darted for the stairs. We reached the ground floor just as our father ran inside and slammed the door behind him. Immediately, something large hit the other side of the door, snarling and growling. My father turned to me and said, "Run." My mother joined him in holding the door, and she also told us to run. My sister didn't even seem to notice me tugging at her, trying to get her away. My mother looked at me and said, "It's time to be the big brother and protector. Run." I summoned all the strength I had and yanked my sister off her feet, dragging her out the back. Just as we reached the rear door, the front crashed open and I saw a monster unlike any I'd ever seen before. It was enormous, with glowing red eyes like pools of fiery blood. It looked wolfish, yet stood on two legs like a man. Just as I caught this glimpse, it killed my father, my mother screaming in horror. I knew she was next and that we would die too. So I dragged my sister into the woods and kept running. We ran for hours, finally stopping to rest and find water. We were devastated. Slowly, a day at a time, we started living again. I knew instinctively in this life what plants were good to eat, and I had a natural skill as a hunter. I taught my sister these things, and we determined ourselves to survive, no matter the cost. And we hated the beast who had killed our parents. Years passed, and we became warriors of the land, sought after to aid in any cause, while constantly looking for any sign of the murderer of our parents. Until one winter, disaster struck again. We were crossing a frozen river that seemed sturdy enough, until suddenly the ground was gone from beneath me and I became swept away in an icy river. I don't know how long I was in the water, but suddenly I was caught on a tree that jutted into the river. I pulled myself, freezing and close to death, out of the water. Fortunately for me, there was a large tree with a hollow in it that I huddled up in. I was able to build a fire and warm myself to stay alive. I survived that day, not knowing where I was or how to find my sister again. I made my way to the nearest city, and for some reason I was tired of fighting. I decided to use my oracle abilities to survive while I looked for my sister. I quickly made a name for myself as the only male oracle in existence, and became ensconced in the local temple. I did not know yet how to use my oracle abilities to find my sister, so I settled for a while, training myself daily while speaking to the people and other kind from their deities. People and other kind came from everywhere in Gaia and found me with the answers to the questions they had of their gods. The city in which the temple had been built became a thriving metropolis, but I was weary of the pomp and circumstance and longed for the day I could find my sister. However, I didn't want to leave the city without an oracle. One day I thought to ask the god Mercury why we didn't have more oracles. He thought for a moment, then showed me how to remove the key from my mind. He then said, no matter what, I would always have my abilities. The key simply unlocks them. He told me to choose 6 young people and other kind that would have no personal ambition and unlock their abilities. And so I chose my 6 young oracles in training, and when I finished, I retained the key. While I was teaching the new young oracles, I ran into Farrell again. Although to the me in that time, it was for the first time. Apparently, she had heard of the young warrior turned oracle and wanted to see for herself. Once she laid eyes on me, she knew exactly who I was before, although she didn't tell me in that lifetime. We became hunting partners for a time, sharing our food in the evening and telling tall tales of conquest. I asked her if she had heard anything of my sister, but she had not. Another time, I described the beast that had murdered my parents. This was something she had news about. She told me the beast I was seeking was once a man named Loup-Garou. Apparently, he developed the abilities one day to change his form. He became a man with the wherewithal to become wolf. A werewolf, if you will. She told me that although he was an original being, he had learned to create more of his kind, building a community of man-wolves. I thanked her for the information and filed it away to hopefully use one day. Then, a few days later, exactly as she appeared, she disappeared, not to be seen again in this life. Not long after she left, an ancient god I had never met before came by looking for her. His name was Nergal. I told him he had missed her by a few days, and he thanked me before disappearing. I continued training my 6 young oracles, and then the day came when they were ready to begin their own journeys as mouthpieces for the gods. As I turned in for the night, my last night as the oracle of the temple, I had a vision. I saw a place, a large cave with many caves connecting to it. It seemed there were shadows everywhere and movement that I could almost see. Then suddenly my sister was in the caves, just standing there. I knew instinctively that she was sad, but not in danger. The vision was gone as quickly as it came. I called out to the god Mercury and asked him about the caves I described. He told me that it sounded like the caves of Patala, the entrance to the underworld known as Nagaloka, the home of the Naga. Upon hearing this, I grew excited. I remembered how our mother had described my sister as a child of the Naga. This must be where she had gone. I set out the very next day, using my oracle senses to locate Patala. I journeyed for a fortnight, but finally arrived in a lush jungle, the likes of which I'd never seen before. As I walked through the jungle, I felt a thin place in the air, something that seemed to be an unseen barrier. I pushed myself through and found myself in the cavern from my vision. Immediately, a being that seemed a hybrid of man and serpent emerged from behind a column of rock and demanded to know what I was doing there. I asked if this place was Patala, and he verified that it was. I told him that I was looking for my sister, a Naga herself. He looked at me for a moment, then told me to follow. He led me through one of the side tunnels, then made me stop at the end, just before I would have walked into the beautiful land on the other side. Wait here, he told me. If one passes this threshold, they cannot again leave unless the love of another pulls them through. He turned and went on his way, leaving me to muse on his words. Not long after, I saw him approaching, my sister beside him. When she saw me, she threw herself at me, joy on her face, only to be brought short by an invisible barrier. I called her name, Guinea, and she responded with mine, Mikkel. I told her about looking for her and finding out about the beast. She conversed with the being beside her, and then I reached through the veil, grabbed her wrist, and pulled her home. The being on the other side nodded in approval as I engulfed my sister in a hug. My sister and I spent a few days catching up and just marveling at being with family again. But then we began to plan. I explained everything I knew about this Loup-Garou and how we might find him to repay him for the brutal murder of our parents. We planned and we plotted and finally set out to bring down our foe. On the journey, Nergal appeared on the path before us to warn us that we were close to our destination and to tread carefully. To my surprise, my sister was able to see the god, apparently from her training with the other Naga. We proceeded as stealthily as possible, but suddenly we found ourselves surrounded by the children of the Luke Guru. The blood-red eyes circled us, and we knew that we were defeated before we ever drew weapons, but we clasped hands one last time and ran into battle. It was a long fight, and we killed many of the monsters, but never got close to our arch-nemesis. Finally, we lay dying within arm's reach of each other. I vowed that if I ever got another chance to see my sister, whether it be in this life or the one to follow, I would protect her at all costs. And then the light in her eyes went out, and I closed my own. Once again in the Shadow Realm, I immediately knew who and where I was. This time it was Mercury's judgment I had to pass. He told me that I was again eligible for bliss, but I told him that I would remain in Sheol so that I could be at the center of everything to come. He smiled and told me he knew, and I left him in search of my parents. I found them, and we had a tearful, joyous reunion before I returned to Sheol to begin my job. This time, I wasn't going to be an oracle in the communications department. This time, I was going to take the job of head of Afterlife Internal Affairs, so that I could keep my finger on the pulse of everything going on in the afterlife. My sister finally found me there in Sheol and decided that she would also stay there with me. To this day, we work side by side, head of AIA and monster hunter extraordinaire. One day, Nergal came into my office and dropped Farrell right onto my desk. I had been waiting for this. Nergal gave her a choice, work with me or get locked down. She chose to work with me. A few centuries passed and Farrell had calmed her ways a bit, enough that she saw that there was some shady stuff going down on Gaia and in the Shadow Realm. To my surprise, she never mentioned the Karmafia. I described the organization to her and she seemed intrigued, but that was all. I told her that I was willing to work with her in this, that we could manage this organization. She agreed, but told me that I would run it. This, at last, was something so different from my first life that I was stunned by the occurrence. I agreed that I would run the Karmafia as long as she helped. She said that she would, but from the shadows and in the background. I set out to round up the members of those who would make up the Karmafia, especially the ones I remembered from my former life. But first, the very first, was my sister, Babs. I started with my sister, invited her back into the Karmafia, and then started making my way around the afterlife, looking for all the familiar faces that I knew had been in the Karmafia in my universe and should be in the Karmafia in this universe. There were so many faces that I remembered, so many faces that brought me such joy to see them again. It had been so very long. I don't think anyone really understood that I had lived another 10,000 years just to get to this moment. To get to this moment in time where I could see all the people that I loved and worked with before. I went around, finding the people that I knew were part of this, inviting them in again. Very few of them declined. Most of them came along for the ride, the same as they did the first time. I was so ready to get the Karmafia back up and running. Well, up and running for the first time in this universe. There were some faces that were notably absent. Although Mercury had promised me that the equivalent of Regal existed in this universe, I had yet to meet him. So, I went around and I found the ones that I remembered. I brought them back into the fold. Of course, it didn't work just like that. Some of them had to be interviewed. Some of them had to be convinced. Some of them thought I was crazy. But in the end, I had all of the people that I needed to make this organization work. It was a long journey. It took not just months, but years to get everyone on board. But I finally had my full complement of foot soldiers for the Karmafia. And we began again. This time, with me at the front lines. God's help us. Oh, yeah, and Mama Mayhem too. Ha. There was one special interview, namely Kat, who I knew as Sheila in the other universe.
Who are you?
I am Angel Dark, Director of the Afterlife Internal Affairs. I'm here to interview you for the Karmafia.
Karmafia? What is that?
Do you have somewhere private that we could talk?
Yeah, come right this way. So what can I do for you?
The Karmafia is a bit of a shadow organization, sort of a well-known secret. Basically, we deliver instant karma, good and bad, whenever we see the need. In addition, we often help out in other ways, like rescues, infiltrations, that sort of thing. Your history came across my desk, and I realized that you have the qualifications to be one of our agents. Your skills from your former life is not the least of them. So, would you be interested in joining us?
It does sound very interesting. But could I have a little bit of time to think about it?
Of course. Just don't take too long, please. I have a mission coming up that I think you'd be perfect for.
How will I be able to get in contact with you?
Here. Call my name while holding this stone, and I will contact you shortly thereafter.
Well, you have a great day.
You as well.
Angel Dark, I have made my decision.
And what is your decision?
I'm ready.
Excellent. Now follow me. And the Karmafia was complete. And then the current timeline caught up to the timeline that I had left in the other universe. And I had my life back. Well, my afterlife. Afterlife Internal Affairs, this is Angel speaking. What do you mean the souls aren't being processed? It's good to be back.